Let's set it alight with this writing here now. We all know, or may know, my thoughts on the original Godard work, A Bout de Souffle. Breathless for further clarification, check my upload for Jean Vigo's L'Atalanta, where I went on about Godard's debut for a slightly related reason, but I may as well summarize it again for anyone new to this publication. I have the highest respect for Godard. Many of his films, Contempt and On, are landmark classics and well worth citing the auteur as an insurmountable genius of this medium, and yet his features prior to 63's Contempt have always had me feeling unimpressed, and it has me aware of a divide which exists between the more impassioned film enthusiasts and the more general public, a divide which I do not enjoy the existence of. Godard was very consciously making his films at that moment for an elitist, cineast clique of the self-hating bourgeoisie. They thoroughly liked a separation between themselves and the yucky general audiences, and I do not like their self-appreciating film fan culture for its own sake dispositions, as I've claimed before. The hostility a general audience feels toward a more adventurous or exploratory, maybe experimental feature film is not a component of this cinema's appeal, and not entirely the fault of the inferred public audiences. It is rather a tragedy, a disappointing circumstance. It is partly the fault of the high budgeted productions being designed to dumb down audiences or just make profits via engineering effectively cultural fast food, and then the insistence of the more cultured blocks in society that think they are superior to these average viewers, born out of these groups emerging from anything but working class backgrounds, and so having repugnant elitism imprinted in them from at a very young age, puts the average audiences off ever more so. While Goddard's existential inquiries in many features made from Contempt and onwards were densely interesting and addressing concerns far more daunting in scope than film and an insular culture around it beyond casual engagement, I consider his earliest titles, again those prior to 63's Contempt, to be generally unremarkable, and whilst I'm his greatest champion from Contempt and afterward, I feel as though a reactionary windbag when decrying his earliest films, though it is rooted in a propositionally egalitarian principle, and perceive the elitist upper middle class or lower upper class in origin pseudo left as potentially quite destructive for the left, and am highly concerned their like for these beliefs are motivated by a feeling that it makes them morally superior, feeding that economic bloc's innate superiority complex, unassailable and never excised. Goddard's more dedicated Marxist mode delivered far more captivating, interesting, challenging films. His 70s films were possibly his most compelling, whether one agrees with the politics or not. I'm far more hesitant to committing violence than the average performative Maoist, although I appreciate that one can't be as optimistically ragdoll as Brother Ginepro in Rossellini's Flowers of St. Francis. His 80s work was mostly less interesting. The 90s are a big waste of all our time, with the unnecessary and generally valueless histories to cinema. And then in the 21st century, he re-emerged as one of the finest auteurs of the millennium and of all time. I'm a major advocate of his 21st century output. Okay, so onto this one. Jim McBride, 1983, American remake, Richard Gere. Let's talk about this thing then. My lack of fondness for the original 1960 Breathless does not affect my view on the American update, not as a snide attempt to pettily dismiss further the Godard debut via praising this title, and not as my scathing it due to my having such scorn for that same initial work. As a piece inspired by the original A Bout de Souffle, McBride's feature borrows the framework and attempts to instead distill a story about America in the early 1980s. It is less concerned with narrative film tropes to elbow your fellow elitist cineasts and chuckle for, and more compelled to present the scaffold as enabling an insightful narrative about a reckless rock and roll dreamer who's on the run, rooted in a timeless, restless existentialism and not influential film tropes. And though he interacts with popular culture, it is for it resonating with him and his interactions with the world around him, and not as a subcultured curator. Breathless 83 can be seamlessly appreciated by any film audience, any fan of Richard Gere, who may be put off by his criminal behaviour and the bleak conclusion, though it is attempting to inform audiences of the tragic pitfalls which the delinquent in our societies, developed societies, were faced with post-war. Empowered by the culture around them, we won the war, let's celebrate and consume, rock and roll excitement, the comparatively behaved civilians of the post-war US can enjoy the rock and roll, vigilante comic characters and cinematic romantic rebels purely as an escape, a mild simulation of what could be, of what adrenaline could truly entail, to know some of the flavour, seemingly whilst not indulging in behaviour which manifests as consequential in the lived real world, whereas the delinquents were given possible further motivation or idealist intensifiers from these same sources of mass media popular culture, and compared to the more suburban, distant fascination of these parameter busting escape daydream outlets or the attempted curator hobbyist categorization, more insular, dedicated assessment of arts and texts, which Godard and his films plays inherently, inescapably represent, and to those who were actually on the edge, yearning for a far more literal escape, facing genuine uncertainty and pre-civilization, animalistic primal fight or flight, they really, really felt the impact of these works, which the academics attempt to compose buzzing feces from. In this respect, McBride may have gone further than even Goddard had in the original feature, for his character felt more like a believable American identity rather than a slicker French archetype based in a passion for American films, and not anything really tangible beyond more insular, snootily misanthropic, scoffing cineast circles. Jim McBride was a filmmaker of the late 60s, releasing 4 features from the late 60s and early 70s, which were undeniably inspired by Goddard in that self-reflective, assertively modernist mode, which they paradigmatically influenced. His 1983 remake of the 1960 picture was his first feature since a 1974 title known as Hot Times, which appeared to be a break from his earlier, more art school ventures, and not for reasons of formative experimentation or a subversive reconfiguration either. It was one of those decade sex comedies, which I assume no one watches anymore or would ever have any remote motivation for. The original film certainly meant a lot to McBride, and he wouldn't have attempted to remake it unless he felt he had a sufficient resonant motivation in doing so. So I do prefer the McBride remake to the Goddard source. Not that I think it alternatively occupies where the original film is deemed as occupying, but I do find it an interesting, quite admirable work. It is thoroughly watchable. It is quite plausibly not at all what the original film was intending to be, but I don't exactly love what the original film was aspiring to be, and I prefer what this film was similarly, but mayhaps more sincerely going for, and I do consider it to be of more value than that original venerated feature. I actually agree with Mark Kermode in this particular instance, though I've been a bit off him ever since he tarnished Coppola's monumental asseveration 2024's Megalopolis, a predictable yet nevertheless disappointing shrieking from Kermode on how the rules and how films ought not be allowed to try for this or that or be ambitious or want to change the space outside the screen itself. Everything has to be something narrow and disillusioned escapist familiarity. If you find it boring, then that's totally legitimate, but don't just disdain the entire effort from the root of it attempting to be of some ambition or audacious significance. I have never been taken with Malick's Tree of Life, though I utterly love his 4 features prior to that. I would never bemoan the film for attempting to be what it is. I just found the effort painfully uninspiring and dishearteningly underwhelming, but not for it wanting to be what it evidently aspires to be. I have seen small fragments of his later films. I saw all of To the Wonder, and that was okay. Not my favourite by any means, sadly. Of the films after that, I haven't been totally compelled to seek them out for my completion, and maybe one day I could. My closest association in cinema enthusiasm and my major influential writer on this topic very much didn't care for those later works, so I perhaps avoided them simply out of an innate respect for them. And regarding Kermode, he hated Goddard's 21st century work quite infamously also, at least Film Socialism from 2010, so perhaps one ought not really worry about his crankiness at Coppola's science fiction paragon. So anyway, let's go back to McBride and finish this facade presto. I would highly recommend that everyone sees this one, fan of the original feature or not, and I honestly wonder now if anyone who hadn't seen the original would actually get much out of this, where a more enthused film viewer is concerned, though at the very least it is certainly the most impassioned pop culture ode to the legendary comics character Jack Kirby's Silver Surfer. Potentially this would be considered a cult classic with or without the original, but I think some people would be unsure of what it was going for without the original undertaking back in the 1960s. Why is she French? Why such a bleak ending? What is the purpose of this plot? What motivated them to write it quite like this exactly? So with the original, we get a greater supplement as to what McBride was striving to achieve, why it even exists in the first, and how ably he delivered on this proposal, how would we assess his reimagining? We're going to endorse it here on the AOD, mainly because I just find it very watchable. An entertaining capturing of colours and then modern America, featuring an enjoyable lead performance, consistent references to the magnificent Silver Surfer, its distillation of pop culture's relevance to everymen and strugglers beyond the hobbyist wannabe curators, the kinetic energy of the direction and editing, the smooth pace and innate enthusiasm permeating throughout every facet of the work, likely stemming from the excited McBride himself.